Hey guys, it's Mr. Gilsdorf. Today we are going to be doing Unit 1, Animal Basics, Section 2. And we're not going to do all, it says Animal Architecture Parts 1 through 3. We're only going to cover Parts 1 and 2 for our homework tonight. We'll finish up Part 3 in class next time because it's a little bit more complicated, so I want to make sure I'm there with you guys and can actually work it out on the board and show you what we're talking about, okay? All right. So the first part of this section, talking about animal architecture, is really understanding how do we describe the locations of an animal? How do we discuss what an animal looks like in terms of making sure we're able to identify which part of the body we're referring to? So these are the first vocabulary words we're kind of getting introduced to. And so the first one is anterior. So the anterior end of an organism is the end where you find the head. Some organisms don't really have a very specific head, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but if they do, that's the anterior end. So our anterior end of our body would be the top part here. The posterior end is the tail end, but I want to make sure that we're clear about the fact that a lot of the organisms we're talking about are kind of either walking on all fours, or it's very clear that there's a tail end. We're upright. So whenever we're talking about these, we kind of want to think about our body like this, like we're laying flat on the floor, where our head's right here, our feet are down here. So when we're talking about that, the anterior end is the head end for the human. The posterior end is not our butt, it's our feet. So we have anterior here and we have posterior down on the bottom. Our dorsal side is our back side, and that's the same thing for all organisms. You see here on the squirrel, the dorsal side is running right there along the back. The ventral side is the front side of the organism, which is the belly side, so that's our side as well. Most organisms, the ventral side faces down and the dorsal side faces up, but we are upright, so we face forward and back. Medial is a term that means that it's close to the center of the body. So for us, medial would be anything kind of really close to the center of our body, found in the center. And lateral means the left or right side. So if you're talking about some sort of lateral part of a body, you're referring to things that are kind of on the left and right edges. And so dorsal would be front, ventral back, lateral on the edges, medial down the middle, anterior is the head end, posterior is the tail end, which for us is the bottom end of our body. So we're going to be going through some of the major characteristics that we use to organize the animals into unique phyla. So last class we talked about the unifying characteristic of all organisms and or all animals, and now we're kind of looking at, okay, so what are some other characteristics that are different amongst animals that we use to then figure out what phylum they're a part of? And so the 5 we're going to cover are going to be organismal complexity, so how complex is the organism itself, symmetry and cephalization, so we'll talk about what that means in a minute. 3 is cleavage and early development. So cleavage of the blastula is what we're talking about. So the zygote as it starts to replicate, as we talked about last time, how it actually replicates determines what kind of animal it's going to be. And then gastrulation and gut formation. So we're going to cover in this video just 1 and 2. So we're only going to cover organismal complexity and then symmetry and cephalization. We'll do part 3 in class, and then your other homework later in the week will be to start covering parts of 4 and 5. So, organismal complexity, in terms of the least complex animals, they are complex or they are organized on the cellular level. So organisms that are the least complex, including the example of sponges, these are organisms where the most complex part of that organism is its cells. The cells don't work together necessarily for any major function, but they perform their own specific function, but there's no organs, there's no tissue, there's no skin type structures, etc. In the middle, the medium kind of organisms are organisms that don't have organs, but they have tissues that work together. So a great example is jellyfish. If you've seen a jellyfish before, you can see through them. They don't have opaque solid organs, but they do have tissues that work together. You could see a jellyfish that kind of pumps its bell to move around in the water. And so those tissues are contracting to use similar to like how a muscle would, but they don't have those complex organisms. They're just working as a tissue. Now, the most complex organisms, I put cats as an example, but that of course includes us and everything else in our phylum. Those are ones that actually have organs. Organs being cells that combine to make tissues, and those tissues work together to make a body within the body that does a specific function. So things like the liver, the brain, the muscles, etc. So those tissues combine together into organ systems. The organ systems that are found in complex animals are digestive, muscular, skeletal, reproductive, respiratory, circulatory, excretory, and nervous systems. So those are kind of the big 8. There's, of course, a few others. There's the endocrine system, but these are kind of the big 8 that we see in complex animals. Now, all of these things serve a purpose. And so even organisms that don't have organs and organ systems still need to digest things. They still need to move. They still need to hold themselves upright. They still need to reproduce. But we'll see that they do those either on the tissue or the cellular level. They don't necessarily work that way on an organ level. Now, moving into the second characteristic that we use to separate organisms into their phyla, the first part of this is symmetry. Symmetry is referring to the balanced distribution of duplicate body parts. AKA, we're referring to how can I split the organism so that both sides of that line are identical. There's several types of symmetry. The first one is asymmetry. Sponges are the only organisms that really undergo asymmetry, and that means symmetry, of course, meaning balanced distribution. A on the prefix means without, so asymmetry means without symmetry. They don't have symmetry. Radial symmetry is a situation where the body parts are arranged around a central axis. So most radial symmetry organisms are circular-ish shaped. So they're things where I can cut the body in multiple planes, and all of those things are going to look the same. So a radial organism is symmetrical around a center point, much like a star or a circle or anything like that. So the body parts are arranged so that when you split it, for the most part, you will find that they are even throughout. This type of symmetry is often found in animals that are sessile, so organisms that are fixed to a surface, or organisms that are found in the water but are free-floating and likely had a sessile form at some point. Bilateral symmetry is when the body part is split left and right. We are bilateral. So even though we're not perfectly bilateral, because if you've ever stared at yourself in the mirror long enough, you might notice that you're not perfectly symmetrical, and that's okay. But for the most part, we're split down the middle. Our brain has 2 sides to it. We have 2 lungs. They may be slightly different sizes, but that's just because they had to be. We have 2 reproductive organs, regardless of which organs you have, and 2 arms, 2 legs, etc. So we're split down the middle. And so bilaterally symmetrical organisms are organisms that are split straight down the middle into a left and a right side. These organisms are organisms that usually move very rapidly and can specifically choose a direction to move in, rather than jellyfish, which have radial symmetry, which kind of just float around and figure it out as they go. Bilateral organisms have that complex movement of saying, I'm going in this direction, I'm going in that direction, etc. So some diagrams to show you again. Phylum Porifera, these are the sponges. They have no symmetry. No matter how many times I try to split this thing, I'm not going to be able to get 2 identical sides to it. Radially symmetrical, and you'll notice it's not perfect. It's a little heavier on one side than the other. It may not have the same number of tentacles, but the idea is still there. It still can be split multiple times into multiple planes that are identical. Bilaterally symmetrical organisms are split down the middle to a left and a right side. Now, cephalization is something that is found predominantly, exclusively in bilaterally symmetrical organisms. So you should probably put a note on the side to say, okay, so then bilateral and cephalization indicate that the organism is more complex. And if it's bilateral and it doesn't have cephalization, well, then it's not as complex as ones that do. So cephalization, ceph means head. And so cephalization is basically saying that the organism is centralizing one of its organ systems, and it's usually the sensory and nervous system. So the sensory and nervous system is organized into one particular location on the anterior end of an organism. So it's important that when we talk about cephalization, we're referring to the production or the creation of some sort of head-like structure on the anterior location of the organism, the kind of either front end as it's moving forward, or for us, our top end. And so that really gave rise to a lot of things, because if you have a bunch of nerves and they're spread all over the body, well, that's great, but they can't really work together to get a lot done. But if you were able to get those nerves into one centralized location, then they can work together to get more done. That allows the organism to start making decisions, to start choosing directions in which to go, because at that point now, the nerves are getting close enough that the organism has enough thought process to actually be able to make decisions. And that's where we are going to stop for the day. So when you're finished taking notes there, just keep that paper open and we'll pick up from next class and keep going from there. All right, I will see you guys then.